June 1611. The ice in James Bay is finally beginning to break. For months, the ship Discovery has been trapped in this frozen corner of the world, surrounded by freezing gray water, drifting sheets of ice, and an endless horizon of cold. The men on board are exhausted, hungry, and ever increasingly angry. Some of them have already gone without any food for days on end. One of the surviving crewmen would later write that they were, quote, resolved either to mend or end. And standing at the center of all that tension is their captain, Henry Hudson. Hudson, an English navigator who had already crossed the Atlantic several times in search of a Northwest Passage, is still intent on pressing forward, even after the brutal winter they've all just endured. Even as the crew is desperately begging him to turn back home. That's the divide. A determined leader on one side and a starving, fearful crew on the other. And here, in the thawing waters of James Bay, that divide is about to crack. Early in the morning, as the ice shifts and the fog sits low on the water, some of the crew quietly gather at the stern. They've prepared the ship's shallop, a small open boat normally used for short trips to the shore. Abacuc Prickett, one of the crewmen who will later survive to tell the story, describes how Hudson is seized and forced into the shallop. His teenage son, John, is forced alongside him, as well as several other crewmen who are either sick, injured, or still loyal to Hudson. They were all forced into the shallop with only minimal supplies, just some clothing, a little food, along with powder and a musket. Enough for the mutineers to later claim they weren't literally leaving them for dead, but of course nowhere near enough for long-term survival in the subarctic. The shallop, once tied fast to the Discovery, was then relieved of its topsails and then suddenly cut loose as the larger ship began to swiftly pull away. The small boat drifted behind the Discovery, with only oars to keep it steady, as the cast-off men stared back at the ship that had just abandoned them. At first, Hudson and the others tried to keep pace with the Discovery. They rowed hard, their oars biting into the cold gray water as the Discovery moved steadily ahead. For a moment, it looked like they might just close the distance between the two vessels, but then the mutineers, tired of the pursuit, unfurled more sails, quickly widening the gap as the Discovery gained speed. The shallop would fall farther and farther behind, first appearing on the horizon as a small shape, then a tiny speck, and then nothing at all. By the time the Discovery's crew lost sight of the small boat, it would mark the last moment in recorded history that anyone ever saw Henry Hudson. As the mutineers turned their ship towards England, leaving the frozen bay behind them, the Discovery would sail home and in its wake leave a mystery, one that has haunted history for more than 4 centuries. What happened to Henry Hudson? Henry Hudson is one of those historical figures who seems both familiar and strangely distant. Today, entire regions and landmarks bear his name: the Hudson River, the Hudson Valley, even Hudson Bay itself. And yet, despite all that, very little is actually known about the man behind the name. We don't know his exact birth date, we don't know what he looked like, we don't even know much about his early life. Hudson enters the historical record abruptly in 1607, already an experienced navigator, already someone trusted enough to be given command of a ship, and from that moment on, one goal seems to have consumed much of his career: finding a faster maritime route from Europe to Asia. In Hudson's time, explorers called it the Northwest Passage, a water route that, if it existed, would allow ships to cut directly across or around the top of North America and reach Asia without having to sail all the way around Africa or South America. It was a dream of faster trade, unimaginable profit, and global prestige. And for Hudson, it became the drive-in mission of 4 separate voyages across the Atlantic. His first two expeditions, in 1607 and 1608, were attempts to reach Asia by sailing over the top of the world. Literally. Hudson tried to sail his small ship into the Arctic, hoping that warmer summer temperatures near the pole might open a navigable channel. But thick ice, frigid winds, and hostile conditions shut both expeditions down. He didn't make it anywhere near Asia. Still, Hudson didn't give up. In 1609, he accepted command of a Dutch ship, the Half Moon, and set out once again, this time aiming for a northeastern route just north of Russia. But when that too became blocked by ice, Hudson made a bold decision. Instead of turning around and traveling back to the Netherlands like he'd done before, this time he disobeyed the initial plans of the voyage and decided to sail west across the Atlantic. By mid-July, the Half Moon made landfall in the New World along the coast of what is now the island of Nova Scotia. Once there, Hudson and his crew dropped anchor, took time to repair the ship, and resupplied themselves by fishing in the cold Atlantic waters. But their actions while anchored in the New World weren't all friendly and casual. On July 25th, a group of about a dozen crewmen went ashore armed with muskets and a small cannon. They assaulted a nearby village, forcing its inhabitants to flee, and then helped themselves to anything they thought might be useful or valuable. It was an early sign that this voyage would be marked not just by exploration, but by brutality as well. From Nova Scotia, Hudson steered the Half Moon south. On August 4th, the ship passed by Cape Cod, and from there, instead of heading straight back across the ocean, Hudson continued down the coastline all the way to the entrance of the Chesapeake Bay. Rather than sailing into the bay itself, he then turned north again, probing the shoreline and searching for any major inlets. Along the way, he found the opening of what we now call the Delaware Bay. He noted it, but decided not to explore it in depth. Instead, he kept moving north. On September 3rd, Hudson reached the estuary of a broad river that European maps of the time sometimes labeled the, quote, North River. Today, we now know it as it would come to bear his name, the Hudson River. Although it is worth noting that Hudson wasn't the first European to enter the estuary. Giovanni de Verrazzano had sailed these waters back in 1524, but it seems that Hudson's detailed exploration would leave a longer-lasting mark, therefore giving the name of the river to him, while the Verrazzano Bridge, which connects Long Island to Staten Island, was given to, well, Giovanni de Verrazzano. But alright. Back to Hudson and his crew. As the Half Moon worked its way along the coast and into what is now New York Harbor, the crew's encounters with the land and its people turned deadly. On September 6th, a member of Hudson's crew, John Coleman, was killed by an arrow to his neck during a clash with the local native inhabitants. The men buried him on a small nearby section of land. It was a sobering moment, a reminder that just as much as they could impose themselves on the New World could impose itself on them. Despite the danger, Hudson pressed onward. Just a few days later, Hudson sailed towards Upper New York Bay and entered it on September 11th. From there, he turned the Half Moon northward into the great river that would eventually bear his name. He managed to trade with friendlier locals, charted the shoreline, and tested the depth of the channel as the ship moved inland. Over the next several days, the Half Moon traveled upriver, passing through what is now the Hudson Valley and eventually reaching the area of present-day Albany on September 19th. Hudson stayed in the region for a short time, anchoring and sending men ashore. His reports from this voyage and the maps that followed would later help lay the groundwork for Dutch colonization in what became New Netherland, especially around the trading post that the Dutch would establish and label as Fort Orange, the settlement that would become the future city of Albany. But even here, in this promising river valley, no hidden doorway to Asia was found. It was a useful waterway for proper settlement, sure, but not the shortcut to the east that Hudson knew his investors wanted. On September 23rd, Hudson made the decision to turn the Half Moon back downriver and begin the journey home. After recrossing the Atlantic and landing in Dartmouth, England on November 7th, English authorities detained the Dutch ship and demanded access to Hudson's logs and charts. Despite this, Hudson managed to forward his written record of the voyage to the local Dutch ambassador, who then made sure it was sent safely to Amsterdam. While the Dutch gained valuable information from Hudson's exploration, Hudson himself was effectively coerced back into English service. Despite the significance of Hudson's third voyage, the violence, the contact with new lands and peoples, the river that would later carry his name, Hudson still hadn't found what he was actually looking for. No river, no inlet, no opening in the continent had yet to reveal a direct path to Asia. And so, Hudson once again returned back to Europe without having completed his goal of finding a northwest passage to Asia. Despite all the challenges faced so far, Hudson's drive and perhaps his stubbornness would somehow earn him one more chance. After 3 failed attempts to find a sea road to Asia, English investors, the Virginia Company and the East India Company, gave him one more ship, one more crew, and one more shot at carving out a northern route to Asia. The ship was called the Discovery, and the voyage it would undertake would become the most infamous chapter of Hudson's life and leave behind a legacy as one of the most haunting mysteries in the history of exploration. By the time Henry Hudson secures his 4th voyage, he's already failed 3 times to do the one thing his investors actually want: find a shorter sea road to Asia, and yet somehow he convinces people to back him again. This 4th attempt comes under English colors. 2 powerful groups, the Virginia Company and the East India Company, agree to fund a new expedition. The goal is once more the same old dream: a northwest passage. But this time, Hudson won't be tasked with trying to go over the top of the world or around the Russian coast. Instead, this time, the plan is to head westward towards the still mysterious waters beyond Greenland and look for a channel through the upper parts of North America. The ship they gave him is aptly called the Discovery. She's not a massive warship or a proud, towering galleon. By ocean-going standards, she's actually relatively small, with a cramped hull and limited space for provisions. The crew that gathers on her deck is a mix of men with different backgrounds, skills, and motivations. Among them is Abacuc Prickett, who will later write the main surviving account of the voyage. Another is Robert Juet, who had sailed with Hudson aboard the Half Moon on his 1609 voyage and is now with him again. And there's Henry Green, a younger man who appears to have been chosen personally by Hudson since the two had known each other previously. Lastly, Hudson brings along his teenage son John to accompany him and his crew on the journey. With one more ship, one more crew, and one more chance, Hudson sets out. There's a lot riding on this voyage. If successful, he might change the map of the world. If not, he might end up as just another explorer who chased a dream and came up empty. The Discovery departed London in April 1610 and directed her bow toward the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The plan is to head northwest, stopping first in Iceland, then skirting Greenland, and from there pushing into what Hudson hopes will be a gateway into the continent. At Iceland, the crew has a chance to refit, take on fresh water, and gather what food they can. Even so, the conditions aren't exactly comfortable. The North Atlantic is not a gentle place, and as they push on, the winds turn colder and the sea is rougher. From there, they sail past the icy outline of Greenland, hugging a world of fog, rock, and floating sheets of ice. Soon, they reach a narrow channel of water. This is the entrance to what we now call the Hudson Strait. To the men on board, it's an unknown passage framed by harsh coastlines and lingering ice. Navigating it is no small task. Thick patches of sea ice, unpredictable currents, and poor visibility make every mile dangerous. But Hudson presses through, steering his small ship deeper into the unknown. On the other side of the strait, their perspective widens. A lot. Instead of a simple channel through the continent, Hudson finds himself sailing into an enormous inland sea. Hudson doesn't yet know the name we give it today, but we do: Hudson Bay. When the Discovery entered this massive body of water, it must have seemed like both a breakthrough and a puzzle. On one hand, the sheer size of it suggests that maybe, just maybe, this is indeed the long sought-after passage, a broad sea that could perhaps lead seamlessly out into the Pacific and be a new route to Asia. On the other hand, the exact coastlines aren't obvious, the various exits aren't yet clear, and the farther they go, the deeper into the unknown they find themselves. Hudson begins to explore along the edges of the vast bay, keeping close to the land when he can, noting the water's depth, and keeping an eye out for currents that might hint at an outlet. However, as summer turns to fall, the days get shorter and the weather grows colder. The crew's supplies are not limitless, and since no one on that ship has any accurate mental image of where they really are, each new inlet could be a promise or a trap. Eventually, as autumn deepens, Hudson steers the Discovery southward, down into what we now call James Bay, a smaller arm at the southern edge of Hudson Bay. It's narrower and more enclosed, and as far as the crew can tell, there is still no western exit, no clear route beyond the continent, and no obvious door to Asia. What there is, however, is ice, and a lot of it. By November, the inevitable happens. The temperature drops and the water hardens. The Discovery becomes trapped in the foreman ice of James Bay. For the crew, this is the worst possible outcome. Instead of turning around earlier and sailing back to England before winter, they've sailed into a dead end and are now frozen in place in a remote and unforgiving environment. Hudson and his men are forced to make the best of a bad situation. They winter there, on the edge of the frozen bay. Some of the crew build shelter on land. Food becomes a pressing concern. Scurvy, caused by a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, starts to creep in. Men grow weak. Joints ache. Old wounds reopen. The cold is constant, and the isolation is suffocating. Supplies dwindle. Rations have to be cut. Resentment grows. Tensions begin to build not just in general, but specifically amongst the crew, who are beginning to question the choices of their captain. Some believe that Hudson has mismanaged the voyage, sailing too far into unknown waters and trapping them in ice when he should have turned back. Old grievances from earlier voyages resurface. Men like Jouett, who had already seen Hudson's leadership style up close in 1609, are not shy about voicing their doubts. Green, who owes his place on the expedition to Hudson's patronage, starts to drift away from the captain's side and closer toward the discontented. All this while the ice holds fast and the bay's cold grip remains relentless. Eventually, the seasons turn and the winter starts to become spring, and after months of cold and darkness, the ice begins to crack. Open patches of water start to appear. The crew can finally start thinking about moving again. For most of the men, the path forward is actually backward. They want to go home. After all, they've only just barely survived their miserable winter in James Bay. They're low on food. They're weakened by disease. The ship has taken a beating, and as far as they can tell, no clear northwest passage to Asia means no safe way out of their situation by sailing westward. In their minds, now is the time to turn the Discovery back east and make their way back to England while they still can. But Hudson, he is of a considerably different mind. As the ice loosens its grip, he senses an opportunity to start off the summer season of exploration already in the New World, meaning that this time around there'll be no need to waste the first of the warmer months sailing all the way from Europe, and so this time giving his voyage the extra time it will need to mount a successful discovery of the Northwest Passage. And what if the passage lies close by? It would mean that if they just push a little bit further, or probe a few more inlets, or test another stretch of coastline, then perhaps they might actually find it. It's almost as if the months of hardship hadn't shaken Hudson's determination. If anything, only sharpened it. However, for a starving and exhausted crew that had just spent a winter on the edge of death, their captain's decision looks less like optimistic courage and a lot more like suicidal madness. Resources are at best low and at worst unavailable entirely. According to the account we have, there may have been little more than a couple weeks worth of rations left at their current allowance. Some of the men claim they haven't eaten properly in days. Rumors circulate that certain higher-ups have been hoarding food. Others insist that Hudson is playing favorites. Trust, once damaged, is now dangerously low. In that kind of atmosphere, it doesn't take much for dark conversations to start. Men gather quietly. They talk in low voices. They begin to whisper about what might happen to them if Hudson refuses to turn the ship around. They worry that if their captain continues to sail them west, they might never see home again. At some point, the talk crosses a line from simple conjecture and into serious consideration. A core group headed by Henry Green, who knew Hudson personally, and Robert Juet, who had seen Hudson remain unfazed by a crewman's death on the 1609 voyage, begin to seriously consider seizing control of the ship. Not just refusing an order, not just arguing with their captain, but actively removing him from command. It's the kind of action sailors know is punishable by death. But, from their point of view, if continuing onward is suicidal anyway, then what really is there to lose? Better to take fate in their own hands, they figure. The question now in their minds is something along the lines of this: act now or starve later. The exact details of what happened next depend almost entirely on one man's testimony, Habakkuk Prickett. He would survive the voyage and later write a narrative of what took place. His version is the one that history inherits. But it's important to remember that Prickett went along with the mutiny, and so had every incentive to downplay his own blame and present the mutineers' actions in the least damning light possible. Either way, according to Prickett's account, the mutiny began to unfold in the early morning of June 22, 1611. The conspirators moved quickly. They make sure they have control of key points on the ship. Hudson is confronted and detained. The authority which he'd held over the course of 4 long and hazardous voyages is violently ripped out from under him. Hudson's teenage son John is grabbed by the mutineers as well. He and his father, along with several other crewmen who are either sick, injured, or still openly loyal to Hudson, are pulled from their places and forced together. The mutineers order them all into the ship's shallop, a small open boat normally used to travel short distances between ship and shore. They give them a limited set of supplies: some clothing, a bit of food, an iron pot, a musket with powder and shot, a few tools, and some basic equipment. It's just enough that, on paper, they could argue that they weren't simply murdering Hudson and his companions outright, but anyone familiar with the climate and geography of James Bay would know that survival in those conditions, especially with such minimal gear between them, would be incredibly difficult, if not practically impossible. Once Hudson, his son, and those forced alongside them were all in the boat, the shallop was cut from the ship, had its topsails removed, and was left to drift in the freezing water. For a brief time, the shallop was able to keep pace with the larger vessel through the use of its oars, and perhaps in that moment, there might still have been some faint hope in Hudson's mind that this was all a temporary act of desperation, that the mutinous crew now in control of the Discovery might relent, bring him back aboard, and settle things another way. After all, the ship's carpenter, a man by the name of Philip Staff, was, while the mutiny was first taking place, actually asking to be placed alongside Hudson in the shallop, requesting only that he be allowed to bring his small chest of personal belongings along with him. During this rather puzzling yet honorable display of loyalty to Hudson, Prickett apparently tried to persuade Philip to remain on board the Discovery, insinuating that perhaps this wasn't the end-all be-all and that Hudson might hopefully be taken back on board later. Whether this was a sincere talk the two had or just Prickett trying to convince the ship's carpenter to stay on board for more pragmatic and selfish reasons, either way, in the end, Philip remained steadfast in his loyalty to Hudson and insisted that he join his captain in the shallop. Nevertheless, whatever hope remained in those confined to the shallop as they initially attempted to follow the Discovery was, in truth, only a mirage. And like a mirage, that hope vanished the moment they sought to grasp it. Eventually, the mutineers have had enough. They're tired of seeing the shallop behind them. They're tired of the possibility that Hudson could somehow regain leverage or sympathy from the rest of the crew. They want a clean break. So, they make one. Additional sails are unfurled atop the Discovery, allowing the vessel to catch even more wind and allowing for quicker sailing. The Discovery begins to move faster, its hull slicing through the cold gray water. In a small boat behind them, Hudson and the others continue to try using their oars to keep pace, but it's to no avail. As the Discovery moves faster and the shallop remains slow, it was only inevitable that the distance between them would begin to widen. To the men still on board the Discovery, their view of the shallop slowly shrinks. First a small shape on the water, then a dot, then nothing. By the time they lose sight of it completely, Henry Hudson, his teenage son John, and a handful of men set adrift with them have effectively vanished from recorded history. From that point on, we only have the mutineers' side of events, and even after their stranding of Hudson's shallop, their troubles were far from over. On the way out of the bay and back through the strait, the Discovery faced storms, lingering ice sheets, and unrelenting hunger. There are accounts of violent clashes with indigenous people along the coast, and of desperate efforts just to keep the ship functional and sailing smoothly. Some of the leading figures in the mutiny, including Henry Green, would die before reaching England. Eventually, and against daring odds, a much reduced crew managed to bring the Discovery back to English shores on October 20th, 1611. When they arrive, many people naturally want to know what happened. Where is Henry Hudson? Why did so many men die? And how did a ship that sailed out under the command of one of England's most experienced navigators return without its captain? The surviving crew members are promptly arrested. Some are imprisoned for years. A formal inquiry follows, and eventually, not charges of treason but charges of murder are brought against the remaining group. During these hearings, Abacuc Prickett's account becomes central. He describes the mutiny, the decision to set Hudson adrift, and the minimal supplies given to the castaways. In the end, the men are not declared to be murderers and therefore not executed. The court's reasoning is that setting, quote, experienced seamen adrift near land that wasn't, quote, barren or uninhabited is not to be judged strictly as murder. Thus, they are acquitted. It's a convenient conclusion for everyone involved. Perhaps too convenient. Why not try the men for treason? Surely that shouldn't be hard to charge them with, given that they admitted to the mutiny. And why not find them guilty of murder? Just because Hudson and most of the men with him on the shallop had sailing experience, it doesn't mean that they'd be able to just withstand the unpredictable elements of a harsh and unknown land. Well, perhaps understandably, some contemporary historians posit that the authorities in England did not want to jail or execute seasoned crewmen with valuable experience and insight regarding the New World discoveries. Therefore, by charging the men not with treason but with murder, the authorities could more easily come to a not guilty verdict, essentially keeping the men, and therefore their memories and experiences gained in the New World, intact. And so the men who took part in the mutiny would walk free, carrying with them the only direct account of what happened in those final days on the bay. Their version of events became history's version of events. In other words, the official story. But did it all actually pan out as we've been told? And what did become of Henry Hudson, his son, and the few crewmen who shared his fate? What exactly happened after the Discovery abandoned them and left their small shallop to drift, isolated in an unknown world on that fateful summer's day? The first and simplest theory is also the bleakest. The idea is that Henry Hudson and the men with him died fairly quickly after being cast adrift, most likely from exposure, starvation, illness, or some combination of all three. If we step back and look at the conditions they were facing, a big part of why this theory is so popular is that it doesn't require much imagination. We know that when the mutineers forced Hudson, his son John, and several other men into the shallop, they gave them only minimal supplies, some clothing, a bit of food, and basic tools and weapons. Enough that they could later argue they hadn't just murdered them outright, but nowhere near what you'd want if your goal was long-term survival in the subarctic. We also know where this is happening. James Bay and the surrounding regions sit in what is still a harsh northern climate today. Even in June, the water is freezing, the weather is unpredictable, and the storms can roll in with very little warning. Hudson and his group would have been in a small open boat exposed to wind, rain, and cold, with no shelter beyond whatever crude protection they could improvise. And then there's context. The men who stayed on the Discovery, the ones with a full ship, better supplies, and the benefit of a larger, more seaworthy vessel, nearly died themselves on the way home. They faced storms, hunger, disease, and conflict. In fact, one of the primary ringleaders, Henry Green, actually would die before making it back to England. So if that's what happened to the better equipped group, it's not hard to imagine how much worse it could have been for Hudson and his companions. On top of that, we know that later expeditions actively searched the surrounding regions for any trace of Hudson or his men. In 1612, just a year after the mutiny, Captain Thomas Button sailed into the same waters during his own Northwest Passage attempt. Button wintered near Hudson Bay and specifically looked for signs of Hudson's party. He found none. His journals describe the region as difficult and choked by ice, but there is no mention of any abandoned campsites, remains, or identifiable artifacts. Another example comes from 1612 to 1613, when Nicolas de Vigneau, a young French interpreter who'd lived amongst the Algonquins, returned to Quebec claiming he had traveled deep into the interior of North America and had found the Northwest Passage, and had even seen the wreck of an English ship whose crew of 80 men had apparently escaped to land and been killed by natives. His story initially captivated Samuel de Champlain, until Vigneau later failed to provide evidence of his discovery. The leader of the Algonquin tribe, who Vigneau had stayed with, said that Vigneau's story was false, and Vigneau himself later admitted that he had fabricated the entire account. Samuel de Champlain would later write, after having spent much time as Vigneau's exploratory companion in the New World, that, quote, "He is the most impudent liar that has been seen for a long time." Despite Vigneau's obvious unreliability, the story is still somewhat relevant given that he's an example that there were Europeans in the relative area of Hudson's last seen location, and yet despite their relative proximity, no verifiable leads emerged. Given that Vigneau claimed to have seen an English ship with a crew of 80 men, and that Hudson was in a small shallop that had only 9 men including himself, it is seemingly unlikely that Vigneau had any encounter with Hudson, since his accuracy on the number of crew would have been off by about 9 times the actual amount. After all, Hudson's original ship, the Discovery, only had 23 crewmen to begin with. If the voyage of Captain Button and Vigneau's likely fabricated story reinforce anything, it's the conclusion that if Hudson and his men had actually reached land, their survival was probably brief and left little to no material trace. Put all of those details together, and Theory 1 becomes pretty compelling. A small boat, limited supplies, brutal climate, and no concrete confirmed sightings afterward. The most straightforward explanation becomes one where Hudson and his group didn't make it very long. But what this theory has in simplicity, it lacks in closure. It doesn't tell us how long they survived. It doesn't tell us whether they reached land, or died in the boat, or scattered in smaller groups. It doesn't tell us what became of the shallop, or whether any of their tools or possessions might still be buried somewhere under centuries of soil and snow. So yes, death by exposure or starvation is probably the default explanation, the one you arrive at if you assume nothing more compelling happened. But as we'll see, there are reasons why some think the story might not have ended quite that simply. The second theory suggests that Hudson and at least some of the men with him did survive the immediate aftermath of the mutiny, and that they may have ended up living, at least for a time, among the indigenous peoples in the region. This idea often starts from a simple question. If the crew of the Discovery managed to find their way out and sail home, why couldn't Hudson's group at least make it to shore? The shallop wasn't some flimsy rowboat. It was a small but capable open boat designed to move between ship and shore. If Hudson and his men were even somewhat close to land or solid ice, it's not impossible to imagine them making landfall. From there, the theory draws on indigenous and Inuit oral histories collected centuries later, particularly those documented in the Canadian Arctic. Canadian author Dorothy Harley Eber, for example, recorded Inuit testimonies in the 20th century that she believed referenced European castaways fit in the description of Henry Hudson and his son. These accounts describe a bearded older European and a younger male arriving in a small boat, strangers who look different from local peoples and who remain for a time under ambiguous circumstances, perhaps as dependents, perhaps as prisoners, or something in between. You can see why people's imaginations immediately jumped to Hudson, an older European with a younger male, arriving in a small boat in a northern environment. On paper, those details line up intriguingly with the image of Henry Hudson and his teenage son John left adrift in the shallop. What makes these traditions especially intriguing is that Inuit oral histories, long dismissed by Western scholars, proved crucial to the modern rediscovery of the Franklin expedition ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Although the vessels vanished in the 1840s during Sir John Franklin's failed voyage in the Canadian Arctic, archaeologists in the 2010s drew on Inuit accounts describing ship locations and ice movements to help guide their search. These Inuit stories proved incredibly valuable when they ultimately led to the discovery of Erebus in 2014 and Terror in 2016. The success of those search efforts has encouraged some historians to revisit Eber's Inuit accounts with renewed seriousness. Part of the strength of this theory is that it gives a plausible next step after the mutiny. Instead of simply vanishing into thin air, Hudson and his men might have done what stranded humans have done throughout history: found land, sought out other people, and tried to survive however they could. However, the fine details of these Inuit oral histories make the comparison not completely conclusive. None of them mention Hudson by name, nor the names of any crew. But of course the pattern, an older European and a younger companion arriving in a small boat near James Bay, cannot be dismissed out of hand. Still, major caveats remain. These stories were recorded long after 1611. Several European expeditions traveled through the region in the centuries that followed, and so these same Inuit communities had multiple encounters with different European sailors and explorers over time. To say with confidence that a particular story about an old bearded stranger and a youth is specifically about Hudson is to make an inference, not an observation. It's just one interpretation of the many that could be made. That doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It just means that the evidence is suggestive rather than definitive. Oral traditions, though some may have proven valuable, can merge or shift over generations, and naturally, the further we move from 1611, the more layers of retelling and translation we pass through, and the harder it is to pin a story down to one name. So Theory 2 sits in an intriguing middle ground, less bleak and desolate than our first theory, but just as complicated and unproven as it is hopeful and optimistic. It suggests a short-lived survival that ended quietly, without written record. It gives Hudson a little more survival time beyond that last glimpse of his shallop in Hudson Bay, but unless we can find something more concrete to connect those stories directly to Hudson, it remains an intriguing possibility rather than a proven fact. The third theory centers on a physical object, an inscribed stone sometimes referred to as the Hudson Stone. You see, back in 1959, road workers near Chalk River, Ontario, unearthed a stone with the inscription HH 1612 Captive. If taken at face value, that's a short but explosive message. HH, it is assumed, could stand for Henry Hudson. 1612 would suggest that he was still alive at least a year after the mutiny, and the word captive would imply that he'd been taken prisoner, likely by indigenous people, and brought far inland from where he was last seen. From a geographical standpoint, this isn't impossible. The waterways of northern Canada form a kind of interlocking highway system. A small group could, in theory, be moved or travel by canoes along rivers and lakes, covering large distances over time. If Hudson's group was taken in as prisoners, guides, hostages, or simply as odd newcomers with useful tools, it's not unthinkable that they might have ended up far away from James Bay. It's also interesting to speculate even further that given Hudson's familiarity with the river that now bears his name and his 1609 visit to what will become Albany, he might have tried, at least mentally, to orientate himself southward. In other words, if he had any choice in the matter, maybe he would have tried to move toward latitudes and landscapes he recognized. All of that makes the Hudson Stone, on paper, sound almost too good to be true. A single object that ties together survival, captivity, and a specific date after the mutiny. And that's exactly why historians have been cautious about it. The core problem is authenticity. The stone itself is not a well-documented archaeological find with clear provenance, chain of custody, or detailed scientific analysis. Although an expert at the British Museum in London claimed that the engraving resembled lettering from 17th century English maps, questions still remain about whether the inscription was actually made during that time period. Back when it was first discovered, the Geological Survey of Canada in Ottawa actually drilled a hole into the rock and determined that it, quote, appeared to have been buried for most of its life. However, the survey still concluded there was no way to tell when the carving was made. Perhaps most frustratingly, the men who discovered the stone in the first place may have accidentally and unknowingly, quote, destroyed any evidence that it was not a forgery when they, quote, in cleaning up the inscription, removed an accumulation of moss and dirt and organic matter. If they had left the rock intact, scientists could have calculated the date of the inscription from the age and thickness of the stuff covering it. The stone's authenticity and connection to Hudson are still debated. Some historians see it as intriguing but unproven, and as far as I could ascertain, no forensic studies have been done to verify the artifact. In fact, as of the making of this video, the stone is perhaps no more protected than when it was first found sitting off a section of road some 60 plus years ago. Currently, the stone is kept outside in a public park in a small town in Ontario. Not exactly the kind of insulated shelter you'd expect to be given to a purportedly over 400-year-old historical artifact. But I digress. All in all, without solid documentation and testing, the stone sits in an uncomfortable middle ground. Intriguing enough to talk about, but not secure enough to build a firm conclusion on. If it's real and truly from Hudson, it changes the assumed trajectory of his disappearance dramatically. If it isn't, then it's just a distraction. Our final mainstream theory doesn't focus on what happened after Hudson was left adrift. Instead, it questions whether the scene we've been picturing, Hudson in the shallop, oars straining in the cold gray water, is actually what happened at all. In this version, some researchers argue that Hudson may not have been set adrift in the way Prickett describes. Instead, they suggest he might have been killed outright, either during the mutiny itself or shortly afterward, with Prickett and the others shaping the story later to make their actions sound less like murder and more like a hard but necessary decision. To understand why anyone would even consider this, we have to remember who our main storyteller is. Abacuk Prickett was not a neutral, outside observer. He was part of the expedition. He lived through the winter in James Bay. He was on the Discovery when the mutiny happened, and he had every incentive, years later, to describe events in a way that kept him out of trouble. When the surviving crew were eventually brought up on charges, they weren't convicted of mutiny. Instead, the courts focused on whether they were guilty of murder. In that context, telling a story where Hudson is placed in a boat with some supplies near land that isn't, quote, barren or uninhabited is a useful legal defense. It allows the mutineers to argue that they didn't kill him, they just left him. Harsh, yes, but not, in their framing, the same thing as killing him with their own hands. Modern historians like Peter Mancall, a professor of history at the University of Southern California, have pointed out a few details that make some people suspicious of the official narrative. After the discovery returned to London, examinations reportedly found bloodstains and noted that some of Hudson's possessions were missing. There are also letters from another sailor that point to a growing personal rift between Hudson and key members of the crew, especially Henry Green. Taken together, those details don't prove murder, but they do raise questions. If Hudson was simply put in the shallop with his son and a few others, how exactly did bloodstains end up where they did? Were they from earlier events? During the winter? From a struggle during the mutiny? We're not told clearly. We also have to keep in mind Hudson's personality. Quote, Hudson was one of the most intrepid and important explorers of his age, said Peter Mancall. He was not a man who easily gave up. By every account, Hudson was a determined and intrepid explorer who was resolute on pressing forward despite the dangers that came with the unknown. Perhaps even after that brutal winter in James Bay, continuing forward is exactly what Hudson would have wanted, and his determination in the face of peril could very well have triggered the mutiny. Furthermore, if Hudson had resisted being removed from command, which seems likely to me given the stakes, things may have gotten violent very quickly. So this theory suggests a darker possibility, that the shallop scene was, at a minimum, edited in the telling, and worst, invented or altered to conceal a killing. In this version, perhaps Hudson never had a real chance of survival at all. The decision to eliminate him and to shape the story afterward might have been part of the same desperate bid for self-preservation. Still, the weaknesses with this theory are obvious. We don't have a body, we don't have a confession, we don't have a second, independent account that contradicts Prickett in detail. All we have is a story from a man who we knew had every incentive to smooth over the truth, plus a few physical clues and later interpretations which suggest that the events on that early morning June summer day were not as clean-cut as the official story presents them. Taken together, these four theories don't solve the mystery. Instead, they map the main possibilities. Maybe Hudson and his men died quickly in the cold, their story ended not far from where the Discovery last saw them. Maybe they reached land and lived, for a time, among people who saw them as captives, curiosities, or burdens. Maybe a carved stone near Chalk River preserves a trace of their fate. Or maybe the real ending was even more brutal, that Hudson never actually left the ship alive, and that the image of him fading into the mist in a small boat is, at least in part, something imagined after the fact. By this point in the story, it's easy to get lost in theories, speculation, and what-ifs. So before we close, I think it's worth stepping back and reminding ourselves of the hard facts we actually do have. We know that Henry Hudson made 4 voyages in the early 1600s. In the process, he massively shaped European knowledge of northeastern North America, sailing up what will become the Hudson River, as well as pushing into the Arctic and lending his name to both the accessible strait and subsequent enormous bay. We know that in autumn of 1611, a year and a half after the launch of his 4th voyage, Hudson, his teenage son John, and 7 other men were not aboard the Discovery when it anchored back in England. We know that they must have actually made it as far west as they claimed, since their ship's logs included an accurately mapped eastern coastline of the previously undiscovered Hudson Bay, as well as an outline of James Bay. We know that our only detailed narrative of there having been a mutiny and subsequent abandonment of the men in James Bay comes from Abacuck Prickett and the surviving crewmen, men who clearly had every incentive to defend their actions and present themselves in the best light possible. Beyond those points, the ground gets softer. The farther we move away from those anchors, the more we're dealing with interpretation, secondhand reports, conflicting testimony, and clues that may never fully line up. So, with all of that said, here's what I'm thinking. The first theory is obviously the simplest and most straightforward one. Hudson and his companions died fairly quickly from exposure, starvation, illness, or some combination of the three. Given the climate, lack of supplies, and the brutality of that environment, it's a very plausible outcome. But if we're looking beyond that immediate assumption, the alternative theory I personally find most convincing is the one that suggests Hudson may never have been given a meaningful chance to survive in the shallop in the first place, and that he was instead murdered. I know, it feels brutal to even speculate that outcome, but I think it's worth considering the facts. Part of the reason for my thinking is simple practicality. If Hudson had truly been cast adrift and then managed to survive, even briefly, among indigenous peoples somewhere around James Bay, I find it odd that Thomas Button's 1612 expedition, which deliberately searched nearby regions, didn't find any trace of him. And it's not just Thomas Button. Later voyages, including those involving figures like Zachariah Gillam in the 1660s, turned up no physical evidence that could be clearly tied to Hudson, no remains of a camp, no artifacts convincingly linked to his final party, nothing that survived in the documentary record. Now, that silence by no means proves that he never reached land, or that he was killed on the spot, but to me it does chip away at some of the more hopeful survival scenarios. Likewise, I find that the murder theory makes a certain kind of grim sense when you consider the kind of pressure the crew were under. The men were starving, exhausted, angry, and convinced that if they followed Hudson any farther, they might never see home again and slowly die in the wilderness. Hudson, on the other hand, was a stubborn and determined captain, not the kind of leader who would calmly step aside. Perhaps what started as a mutiny could have quickly turned into a violent struggle had Hudson seriously resisted removal. In that speculative context, the mutineers' later reshaping of the story into one of a successful and non-violent seizure of power, where they simply left him near land with some supplies, becomes a useful legal shield and a kind of half-truth based on their intentions. That said, I have to emphasize, this is just my interpretation. I have no more evidence for this theory than the information you've been presented in this video. In addition to this just being my speculation, there's also one piece of the puzzle that makes any neat theory hard for me to fully commit to. That is the so-called Hudson Stone. If, for whatever reason, the stone were one day firmly authenticated, if it were proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be a genuine 17th century carving that was made in the early 1600s, then it would throw a serious wrench into both the quick death theory and the immediate murder theory. A credible HH 1612 captive inscription would, at least for me, explicitly imply a connection to Hudson and implicitly imply survival, movement inland, and captivity at least a year after the mutiny, and I think it would force historians to rethink almost everything. Nevertheless, as of right now, we simply don't have that level of certainty. Underneath so much of our discussion and speculation sits one unavoidable problem. Our main storyteller was himself part of the mutiny. Abacuk Prickett wasn't a neutral observer, and he wasn't writing for a modern documentary audience. He was writing in a legal context where his exact wording could have meant the difference between personal punishment by death or potential freedom through acquittal. Because of that, we're left with a tough question. How much of his account can we safely take at face value? Where is he being straightforward, and where might he be smoothing over details, changing emphasis, or omitting things entirely? That uncertainty is exactly why some people don't put much stock in Prickett's version at all, and instead lean hard into alternatives like the murder theory and suggest that the entire story, including the mutiny itself, the severed salop, and subsequent abandonment, was all no more than legal fiction written after the fact to cover up the crime. Or in some cases, people lean into mixing and matching speculative details in conjunction like the Hudson Stone along with Nicholas de Vigneu's claimed sighting. Despite Vigneau's obvious unreliability, some point out that perhaps he was simply exaggerating a real sighting or maybe parodying a story he had heard from other native tribes. Believers in this idea point out that Vigneau was living with native tribes on an inland island only about 30 miles from where the Hudson stone was later found. They posit that Hudson may have traveled the length of the Hurricane River southward, after which it would have been only a day's walk to reach the Ottawa River, the river whose banks the stone was found on. Either way, without corroborating hard evidence or confirmed archaeological discoveries, any of the more obscure and combined speculative theories about Hudson's true fate, which either didn't make my research or just weren't presented amongst this video's main four, perhaps serve most of all to highlight just how fragile our evidence really is. When everything hangs on one compromised narrative, it opens the door for a lot of creative reinterpretation. So where does this all leave us? Well, for all the pages that have been written about Henry Hudson, there are still basic questions we simply can't answer. Did Hudson ever reach land alive after being separated from the Discovery? Did he step onto some lonely, windswept shore and make a final stand there? Or did he die in the shop itself, surrounded by freezing water on all sides? Did he or any of his companions have sustained contact with local indigenous peoples? Could some oral histories or archaeological finds that we already know about be quietly connected to Hudson in ways we haven't yet recognized? Is there, even now, undiscovered physical evidence out there somewhere? The remains of the shallop, scattered personal items, a campsite, or a more verifiable inscription carved into rock or bone, something that would let us move even one of these theories from maybe to almost certainly. Until or unless something like that comes to light, the mystery is going to remain exactly that, a mystery. And in the end, we're left with less of a clear answer and more of a faint image. A small open boat, freezing cold water, drifting ice, a stubborn, driven navigator, a teenage son who followed him across the ocean, and a handful of men caught somewhere between loyalty, desperation, and fear. We watch that boat fall farther and farther behind the Discovery until, eventually, it disappears into the haze on the edge of James Bay. After that point, history goes quiet. No confirmed sightings, no confirmed evidence, no agreed upon ending. Whatever really happened to Henry Hudson, whether he died quickly in the cold not far from where the Discovery last saw him, whether he survived for a time as a captive or dependent in a land far from home, or whether the truth is something even more brutal and tangled than we've imagined, the evidence, much like the man himself, has largely vanished into the ice and silence of the North.